Every songbird in the world, all of them, came out of Australia. Every robin, rook and nightingale in Europe, America and Asia, all of them are descended from ancestors who once thrived here in these lands 50 million years ago. For so long the conventional wisdom was that songbirds originated in the Northern Hemisphere and were funnelled through Asia into Australia. But evidence for the Australian origin of songbirds has been building over the past few decades, and now it seems conclusive. But many scientists in America particularly were really extremely resistant and even hostile to the idea that songbirds came out of Australia. Probably because it was like, for them anyway, turning a map of the world upside down and telling them that this is what the world really looks like. Tim Lowe is a naturalist, and he's written an absolutely fascinating and very beautiful book about birds in Australia, and the book is called Where Song Began. And his starting point is that Australian birds are so distinctive. They're at least as distinctive as our mammals. He says Australian birds are more likely to be noisy, they're more aggressive and more intelligent than anywhere else. And they're addicted to the sugary nectar that they get from our forests of flowering trees. Tim Lowe thinks that by and large we're happy to live among the birds of Australia, but we don't give them too much thought to how far out and unusual they are. And we don't know the story of how they came to be that way. Tim's book reveals the ancient origins of Australian birds and the epic dramas of their complex lives that are played out just above our heads. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Richard.
I love this book so much. I enjoyed it so much. It's such a pleasure to read a book like this and to see how our perspective on birds, the birds of Australia, have changed. Let's start with the early settlers of Australia that came here from Britain. What did they make of the bird song of Australia when they got here, Tim?
Look, Richard, I think they were so homesick that they wouldn't have been satisfied with whatever they heard, but they hated the birds. You know, they just complained that there was no singing, that they just squawked, that they couldn't hold a tune. And the birds were more colourful in England, but they just didn't care about that. They wanted the song. They didn't get the song. You know, they wanted to feel their spirits uplifted. I mean, there were even, in some of the comments, the implication that Australians would turn into barbarians if they didn't have the uplifting music of European birds.
Oh, right, the bird song. Oh, they thought that bird song was morally improving from Europe.
Absolutely. Oh, yes.
And that Australian bird song just couldn't possibly do that, too much squawking.
Yeah, Professor McCoy in Melbourne, that was his line, that you had to bring out the nightingales and larks to uplift the spirits, to ennoble the spirit of Australians.
Well, they are true to a large extent insofar as most Australian birds do go, they squawk, and it's not always particularly pleasant music. So why do Australian birds sound harsher than birds from the Northern Hemisphere, by and large?
Yeah, no, well, you're quite right that I think a lot of people would operate from the assumption this was just Northern Hemisphere prejudice, but I say, no, there really is a lot more squawking. And if you think of where we hear birds making the most noise, lorikeets flying into flowering eucalypts or grevilleas, massive screeching. I mean, they're all squabbling over food. And our honeyeaters are really noisy. They're always fighting. And so it's nectar. Nectar's really driving a lot of this noise. And so one of the things that makes Australia really unique, well, I hate that, overusing that word unique, but hey, it's got to come up in a conversation like this, is we know we're dominated by eucalypts. And what makes eucalypts different from all other trees that dominate other continents is the extent to which birds are pollinating them. You know, if you go through Europe, look at oaks, elms, beeches, all the pines, conifers, they're just wind pollinated. Here, an equivalent forest, you've got birds by day, bats by night. And the sugar in the flowers, it's a very defendable food resource. If you've got a big flowering grevillea or banksia, a bird can just sit on that, and those flowers are secreting food all day, and so they'll fight to control them. You don't need to be clever to find that food. You just need to be bombastic to maintain control. And so we have all these massive fights and squabbles and feuds, birds coming and going out of the flowering trees. You can sit there with binoculars under one gum tree, 6 or 8, even 10 species of bird coming and going. And you think of it from the point of view of the tree, it's just fantastic, because all the birds that get driven away, they've got a bit of pollen on them. You know, they've come into the flowers, had a little bit of a suck, they've been driven off by something bigger, they fly off to another tree, have a go there, and they're just moving pollen all over the place. Some of these birds are moving 10 or 20 kilometres in a day, and so that is just fantastic pollen transfer. And if the birds weren't fighting, the pollen wouldn't get moved like that.
So in Europe, by and large, the birds then there aren't so many nectar eaters, and so what they're getting is seeds and that kind of thing off the forest floor.
Yeah, or they're eating insects. There's not one single canopy tree in Europe that is is pollinated by birds. So you won't ever see a bird in Europe going up into the canopy visiting flowers for nectar. It's just not happening. And even the smaller plants, there are a few shrubs that they'll visit, but there are no specialised nectar. Like we have the word honey eater, and you have hummingbirds in the Americas. There's nothing that has that kind of label associated with nectar in Europe. They must have been there millions of years ago, but they didn't make it through the ice ages.
So all that squawking is over a fight over a fixed resource like honey then. It's good, like the nectar is in the tree, the tree's not going anywhere, and so they need to squawk to defend that territory, to defend that food resource. That's it.
It's a renewable resource, that's right. So to find nectar, hey, it's not hard in Australia. Big flowering eucalypt, Grevillea banksii, it's just nectar city. The trees are just advertising. I mean, you don't need to be smart to find nectar in Australia. And so the skill that you do need is to maintain control over the resource. And so it's whack, bam, fight, kick. I mean, there's massive feuding going on. And this was the thing that got me started on this book that I spent, it was 1994. I spent 6 weeks in Africa. I finally see a drongo chasing a hawk and it just goes bang in my head. I think, I haven't been seeing birds fighting each other. And I'm flicking through my notebooks, and it just stuck in my mind that in Australia, in my garden, just looking out the window while I'm, writing an article or something, I can see more fighting than I would see in a week or a fortnight in any other country I've been to, apart from a few places where you can hang around flowering plants and see the same fighting.
It's kind of unusual how we've come to accept the fact that birds fight in Australia. And here we have to talk about magpies, don't we? Magpie attacks are so commonplace. But how rare is that compared to the rest of the world?
It is rare. So there was a Canadian biologist who did a book about birds, David Bird, and he nominated the Australian magpie as the most aggressive urban bird in the world. There's a hawk in North America will occasionally chase people, but it is really quite uncommon. I mean, magpies in England, they don't go around. A lot of birds will drive you away from a nest when you're really nearby, but that kind of sense, walking along the park, then snap, snap, snap at the bill. Oh, man, what was that? And then there it is, you're getting hit by a magpie and you run away. I mean, for us as Australians, that's quite normal, but that is not normal anywhere else.
I know, I've been attacked by a magpie while riding a bike, and the magpie seems to know to actually swoop in and get inside the helmet, actually, to peck me on the cheek, to actually miss the helmet entirely, to get me on the fleshy substance of my cheek, which shows a fair few brains. What kind of stories of magpie attacks, extreme magpie attacks, have you heard over the years?
Oh, well, they take out eyes. I mean, I think you're mistaken, Richard, in thinking that it's going for your cheek. They're going for your eyes.
Oh, my God. I'm not going outside ever again now, by the way.
And what amazes me about this is that, children in particular are losing eyes to magpies, but there was a case in Toowoomba where a boy lost his eye, he lost the sight in one eye to a magpie, and the magpie wasn't killed. I think this is the wonderful thing about Australians, that with some exceptions, like there's a lot of hostility towards flying foxes, which I think is very misplaced and exaggerated, but here was a magpie that had blinded a boy in one eye, and a lot of countries in the world, people would go for the gun, but it was just moved out of Toowoomba.
You got an account here from an academic at Griffith University called Darryl Jones, who told of one terrorised school in Brisbane where, I quote, over 2 weeks a bird cut the faces of more than 100 children, and on one particular morning throngs of screaming parents at the gates were trying to get their terrified children to run quickly across the open area to the main building where the school medical officer was waiting with the first aid kit. That is odd, isn't it, I suppose, when you put it like that? I suppose we accept that as what is part and parcel of life in Australia.
We do, yeah. Darryl's a good friend of mine. He's written a whole book called Magpie Attack. I mean, the idea that you can write a whole book about one kind of bird attacking people in Australian cities, I mean, that really says it.
And yet they have this really beautiful bird song. That's the sound you hear when some mass-produced product is putting an ad on TV and they want to put that in the background to make it sound like their product is farm fresh, isn't it? That's the kind of sound we associate with the Australian bush.
Yes, we're not real forest dwellers, so the magpie is not a bird you'll get deep inside forest, but to me that conjures up the kind of house on a rural setting where you've got wide open paddocks, and the magpie's carolling from the tree, and then it's walking around on the grass getting the earthworms, and it is something that Australians love, that sense of I'm out in the country, it's peaceful.
Yeah, you can smell the eucalyptus just about when you hear that beautiful warbling. I could talk to you for a whole hour, it turns out, about lyrebirds, Australian lyrebirds. This was, for me, the most fascinating part of the book, and I had no idea. New research shows that Australia is the original home of the songbirds, and how far back do they go in Australia?
That's actually very contested. It would certainly be 30, 40 million years, or certainly more than 30. So it's possible they go back before Australia had actually broken away from Antarctica and was still part of Gondwana. But whatever it is, it's a really long time.
How powerful is the lyrebird song? How loud can it get?
Loud enough that it can be hard to approach a chick in a nest. I mean, supposedly you can hear them like a mile away. I don't know. I mean, the trouble with lyrebirds is that they attract all these kind of legends. You know, it's a bit like Tasmanian tigers. And so I was a bit worried that I put in my book a long list of stories about them imitating weird and wonderful sounds, and they all seem to be true.
Indeed. I've got a recording here. This is the normal song of the lyrebird, which is, acclaimed all over the world as perhaps the most beautiful song that comes out of any bird. And that's the lyrebird, and they also have this incredible power of imitation. This is not a kookaburra, this is a lyrebird impersonating a kookaburra. That is actually a lyrebird and not a kookaburra. And they can also impersonate all kinds of human things. This is extraordinary. This is audio of a lyrebird. I'm not making this up. This is an actual lyrebird impersonating a chainsaw gang in a forest. They've even got the sound of the kind of the bit of the timber starting to snap. That's actually made entirely by a lyrebird. What other sounds have you heard lyrebirds are able to recreate? Well,
actually, in that first segment where you said this is a lyrebird, there was a whipbird imitation at the end of that. So they often imitate whipbirds, king parrots, bowerbirds, and bowerbirds mimics themselves. So it goes on and on. I mean, you know that lyrebirds were taken to Tasmania in the 1930s. David Flay was involved with that, and they were imitating the calls of whipbirds for like 10 or 20 years after they were translocated, because they actually learn off their fathers. So it's really amazing when you think they're such good mimics. But a lot of the learning, obviously not all the time, or they'd never pick up on chainsaws, but a lot of it they're actually getting from their fathers. I mean, it just gets weirder and weirder the more you look into them.
Do they imitate human speech?
The Albert's lyrebird's known to do that. So I haven't heard this myself, but this talk about them, it comes out gargled, so hey Bill, and just the odd word that you can hear in amongst it.
It'd be very disconcerting to hear that. Lyrebirds, you say, seem to be the closest living relatives to the original songbirds that evolved in Australia, or the territory now called Australia. If the lyrebird, though, has the loudest and richest vocal abilities of all the songbirds, why is it that every other songbird seems like a kind of a pale photocopy of the lyrebird? It doesn't have the kind of richness and intensity of song that the lyrebird has?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's one I struggled with quite a while. And I was talking to another biologist, Les Christidis, that I think really got me onto an understanding of it. I mean, you've got 4,500 species of songbird in the world. They're super successful. You walk around the forest, any continent, there they are, the little birds flitting everywhere. If they all had the vocal repertoire of the lyrebird, that's singing in spring. It would just be a cacophony. It would be confusing. They'd all be overlapping with each other. So you had to have the specialisation in song so that you could go from a very small number of songbird species into evolving a very large number. And we know that call recognition is really important in allowing different species to diverge. So they had to get narrower to fit more species into a forest.
Kind of like the Tower of Babel story from the Bible, isn't it? Everyone speaks in this cacophony of languages, and then it all has to be separated out into each individual language of the bird.
Yeah, lyrebirds actually call mainly in winter when there aren't many other birds calling. So they really are out to avoid overlapping with a lot of other birds. They've really got it to themselves.
Lyrebirds have this incredible repertoire of song, and yet apparently they have fewer and weaker vocal muscles than other songbirds. Wow, is that a mystery? Is that a mystery, Tim? I don't understand.
Yeah, look, I can't explain that either. And I must admit, my jaw dropped when I first read it. And, you kind of reread it and check it. But yeah, it shows that you don't need a lot of vocal muscles to do amazing things. I mean, they do move their head around more than a lot of other birds. So it looks like that's how they're compensating for having fewer vocal muscles than other birds. And really what you've got in Australia is that we've got these really archaic bird groups. Tree creepers are another one where their vocal muscles are quite different. I mean, there are 3 kinds of vocal muscles among the songbirds, and the lyrebirds and the scrubbirds. I mean, you haven't mentioned scrubbirds. There are also this very early lineage tree creepers. There's just a few of each species of these. And then this third throat design, that's the one that spreads out Australia. And all nightingales, larks, robins all around the world, they've got this third throat design. But we've got these 3 designs. And people who looked at the anatomy of the bird saying, well, what's going on here? And it is just a way of telling us that these birds have been in Australia so long. Very early on, they were going in all these different directions, and there was one direction that, bang, just took off around the world.
What is the lyrebird trying to communicate with its song?
Oh, it's trying to impress females. So it's saying, look at how versatile I am. I mean, if you can play fantastic musical instruments, I'm sure you're going to pick up more women. That it's about success. So they're promiscuous. I mean, the males don't help at all with the rearing of the young. They're just showing off. So the female wants the male with the best song.
So it's not about brute strength then. It's not about I have the strong. It's not about displaying a display of strength. It's a display of versatility and intelligence.
It's very much a display of intelligence. So to be able to be the best singer in your valley, you have to be very old. So that means you've survived the foxes and dogs and dingoes or whatever. And yeah, you've just kept developing your skills. So it's a measure of your mastery and success. And I mean, same with people. I mean, a very talented male has more sex appeal than someone with no skills at anything.
I know this. It's probably hard to answer this question. I don't know if you can, but is it all business with lyrebirds, or is it? Do they sing for pleasure?
Oh, Richard, I think that's a really interesting question. I assume that the very concept of pleasure evolved so that we would do things. So I think they're loving it. I think they're really going for it.
We have to imagine a time if songbirds all came out of Australia when the earth was full of animals that didn't sing and there wasn't bird song in the world. I wonder what the world would have sounded like without bird song there before they arrived.
Yeah, well, you take them away and you get birds like kookaburras that are very striking but very monotonous. I mean, if you look at where there is song elsewhere in the world, humpback whales, but it doesn't give us pleasure. Frogs, very monotonous, can be quite appealing. Insects, chip, 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 can be very pleasant. But once again, there's no real repertoire. And so I really think that the evolution, music, our capacity to really enjoy music to the extent we can, it's come from our exposure to songbirds over thousands and thousands of years.
So I suppose birdsong is the closest thing in the world to music, the music that we make ourselves.
Absolutely. I mean, Charles Darwin, he's a very, very smart man. And one of his comments was that human tastes and the tastes of songbirds, they're very close together. We love the beauty of birds and we love their calls. And I'm sure we've been influenced by that. That if you think of hunter-gatherer societies developing their sense of beauty, that you're going to be influenced by beautiful bird song and you're going to be influenced by the beauty of birds. And of course, New Guinea is the real example of that, where the birds of paradise have had an obvious impact on the whole sense of beauty. When we listen to Mozart, there's something of songbirds having influenced our ancestors that's coming out in that music.
Composers have often said that too, haven't they?
Absolutely.
They've found inspiration in birdsong again and again.
Yes.
The bellbird is another kind of distinctive Australian bird that makes the most beautiful noise. It's the most beautiful bit of birdsong, isn't it? Just got that chime. It's so pleasing to hear. It makes us really happy to hear it. How territorial, though, are bellbirds, Tim?
Well, it's funny that you describe it as a beautiful call. I mean, I find it pleasing for about the first minute, but if you wander around for a while in among bellbirds, you don't hear anything else, except they do go into this, they've got a really harsh call as well. And that's when any other bird turns up. And so they are incredibly savage birds, and they drive all other birds out of their forests. And in fact, that tinkling sound, which is going from dawn till dusk, 365 days of the year, it's not a spring song. That is just saying to everything else in the forest, stay away, stay away.
Oh, it's a threat.
Oh, absolutely.
The bellbird's song is a threat?
Yes.
Stay away or we'll kill you? Who kill what? What animals is that directed at?
Well, they're described as farmers. I don't know if that farming is quite the right word, but they're these little lerps, these little bugs. They suck the sap out of the eucalypts, and there's a lot more sap that they're sucking out than they can actually use. They make these little shelters for themselves on the leaf, which stops them drying out. And these are quite sweet because congealing sap's got a bit of sugar in it. The bellbirds eat that. That's their main food. But they leave it off without hurting the bug most of the time. And so the bug grows a new one. And for this reason, they're regarded as farmers. So rather than like harvesting the milk of the cow, you take the cap of the lerp insect. Now, there are a lot of other birds that would like to eat that lerp, little pardalotes, rosellas, thornbills. It's those birds they're talking to, but they're indiscriminate. It doesn't matter whether you eat lerp or not. You can't go into a bell miner colony. But they're so bad at guarding this resource that the trees eventually get too many of these bugs sucking their sap and they die. And you can see this all over southeastern Australia, around Melbourne, west of Sydney. It's a major problem in New South Wales, these dying forests.
So the bugs create this sugary resource that the bellbirds can eat and consume, and because they protect it so heavily, the bugs infest the tree and kill the tree, essentially, over time. Can they wreck a forest?
They are wrecking forests. This is happening over vast areas. It's typically happening where where there's been some logging. I mean, if you go to Cunningham's Gap, west of here, there's vast tracts of dying trees on the way up. And there's a bellbird lookout, stop in to hear the bellbirds, but you look at the trees, you can see they're sick. The tops of the trees are all dead.
You mentioned there lerp, a substance that's made by these insects. There's another substance that comes out of trees called manna. What is manna? It's
beautiful to taste. I mean, I often nibble on lerp, but manna's just really nice. So we don't actually know. It's something to do with insect damage. We don't know what insects cause it, but it oozes out and it congeals these lumps of something like sap. They fall on the ground or you can pick them off leaves, but they're just beautiful to eat. And it's amazing to read a lot of the 19th century these sort of colonialists who come out, spend a few years in Australia and then write a book about it. They'll often talk about, we wandered in the countryside and we gathered the manna, and they were picking bits of manna off the ground and eating them. And it was a beautiful food, very important to Aborigines, and a major food of, once again, these honey eaters, these aggressive birds.
And what this is sugary, this sugary sort of lump, is it? And is it fizzy or something like that? Is it like sherbety or something?
Yes, it is like sherbety. There's some amazing descriptions of, that it tasted like icing off a wedding cake, and all these sugary, like sweets from the 19th century. I don't know what these things taste like, but you've got all these old descriptions. And this manna, it was exhibited in Europe. It was one of the wonders of the age. And there were proposals to create industries in Australia in the 19th century out of lerp and manna, using them as starch for stiffening shirts or flavouring beer. I mean, this whole Australian history is so rich. There's so much that no one knows about anymore.
And have you eaten manna and lerp?
Yeah, of course. I've actually had an amazing experience. Hobart's got manna gums in a park. You can walk there from the inner city. These giant manna gums, massive trees. They are clearly older than white settlement in Australia. Like, they're 2 metres wide at the base. I picked up the manna, and I know that manna from Hobart was exhibited in Paris. I think it was 1855. And there's actual description on the label saying that the manna was found in the Domain. This is the very park. And I'm thinking, I could be eating manna off the exact same tree that these colonists were collecting it from. They commented on the Aborigines eating it, and that the same tree is still producing manna that was an Aboriginal food 200 to 300 years ago.
And all our birds are eating this stuff. Of course, any bit of manna or lerp that they can get hold of. You mentioned the kind of aggressiveness. We all know what kids are like after they've had too much sugar. I just wonder if that accounts for their aggressive temperament, or if that's just a fatuous thing.
Well, it's certainly part of this whole story of these highly aggressive birds and all these harsh noises that people were hearing. They're fighting over nectar, manna, lerp, all these weird substances up in the trees. People just don't look up in the gum trees to see what's going on.
This is something you see all the time, and this is a large part of your book, isn't it? The fact that people don't see what's going on just above their heads in Australia.
I think that's right. I think that we've become a very urban society. Nature's seen as too specialised, and that, really the reason for writing the book is to say, look, this is just amazing. There's this whole other community, apart from the community of people, there's this community of nature. Look at what is going on around you, and you can see amazing things while you're standing waiting at the bus stop.
My guest today is Tim Lowe. Tim is a naturalist. He's written a book called Where Song Began. It's the story of Australian birds, their origins, and the little dramas that are going on all around us as we walk through the streets of our cities and then through the countryside and out the bush as well. Noisy miners, Tim. Noisy miners. You say that they're the ultimate aggressors as birds in Australia. Who and what will they attack, noisy miners?
Well, it's really who or what will they not attack. And so they've been seen attacking cows. They're really good at locating snakes in my garden. And they've got different calls for different things. So,
what, do they alert you to snakes in your garden?
Oh, absolutely. Almost every snake I've seen in my garden, they've got quite a distinctive call. So, I'll hear them calling all the time, and I go, ooh, there's a snake out there. And I've actually come out at the very moment when a green tree snake was grabbed, a water skink, like a big chunky lizard. And the two of them are tumbling down the steps out in my front doorstep. Another time it was a brown snake. And the miners will let you get really close when they've alerted you to something. Another time I was going off to visit my father in about half an hour, and there's a carpet snake climbing up into my wheelbase in my car. I would have killed it if I hadn't known. And the noisy miners, they go, bah, 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 and there's this big python coiling up in my car, and I'm sort of dragging it out. But you can get very close to them, like they confide in you when they've drawn your attention to something.
And does that call say snake, or does it just say intruder?
There's certainly some specificity, because when there's a bird of prey, there's it's a very high pitch. Now, I've seen that call, rushed outside, and a little sparrowhawk flew over, and all the lorikeets understood the call. So there's a flowering eucalypt near my house. All the birds in the trees just froze when they heard that call. The sparrowhawk glided over the top of the tree, and then about 10 or 20 seconds go by, and then slowly all the birds start moving and the calls come back. So, yeah, it's very effective communication between species, and quite specific.
Yeah, as you say that, I sort of feel a little sad, because I sometimes I know when there's some kind of a drama going on in my garden, and I don't know what to look for, though. When you know something's going on, but you don't know what it is if you don't know what to listen for or what to look for. And there it is. You see these things.
I think birds are wonderfully rewarding, because not only have you got they're easy to see, compared with our mammals and reptiles, which are not easy to see, but the whole acoustic side. You can be lying in bed in the morning and just wake up and think, there's some beetles flying over the roof, and there's a scarlet honeyeater turned up. There's they're telling you that they're around, and so, I'd much rather listen to that than a radio broadcast. And then, of course, anyone can hear that, but it doesn't mean much to most people. But I think, when I hear the beetles going north, I think, of course, it's autumn. They're heading north for New Guinea for winter. So, there's a seasonality that goes with it.
Is it unusual for a bird like the noisy miner, when it arrives, a kind of a commune of them, if that's the word for it, arrives? I'm sure that's not the collective noun, but when a group of them arrive into an area or into a tree, is it unusual for one species to push every other species of bird out, like the noisy miner does?
Absolutely. It's globally unique. So it's only noisy miners and bellbirds, which are properly called bell miners. They're the only two birds in the world that do that. And yeah, it was actually a Canadian. He was a lecturer of mine in the 1970s. He came out to Australia to study birds, and he's going, what are these things? What is going on? So he was the first to document them. It took someone with foreign eyes to really see how unusual they are.
And do they fight amongst themselves as well?
Well, one thing that's been noticed is that the number of males in their colony is much higher than the number of females. It's assumed this is because the males are actually killing young females. So, yes, they're always fighting each other.
You describe their society of the noisy miners as promiscuous and violent. And they sort of remind me, a bit like the mafia. They sort of come into an area, they sort of soak up all the resources, keep everyone else out, and eventually kind of ruin the joint, and then maybe move on. I don't know what they do. Is that fair enough?
Well, Richard, one of the things I find amusing is that, I read the academic journal articles about birds, and when you read the journal articles about noisy miners, you get words like thugs, despots, hyper-aggressive, and you think these academic journals are letting these words slip in because these birds have such a powerful effect on biologists.
I know, and I know we're not supposed to do this. I know I'm not supposed to sort of project human-like qualities onto birds, but I can't help it. It's sort of there and it presents itself, and I know it's very unscientific, but nonetheless, it helps us understand to some degree. Now, the most interesting and the biggest revelation in your book for me, Tim, was that songbirds originated in Australia. For most of the 20th century, you say that scientists thought that these songbirds had their genesis in the northern hemisphere. How did the theory go? How was the old theory of the origin of songbirds go?
Well, it was really thought that everything began in the northern hemisphere, and you can actually take it all the way back to Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. And so he outlined the argument that because you had so much land coalesced together, you've got Europe, Asia, Africa, all joined together, and then sometimes birds can fly across from North America as well, that there are so many animals in that vast area that the levels of competition are much greater than you would get in the southern hemisphere. Therefore, they've evolved to a higher degree. Now, that idea was really strengthened in the 20th century, and so you had Ernst Mayr, a leading biologist, pushing it. And so the idea was that Australia had essentially been a terra nullius, that it hadn't had any birds and that they just flowed into Australia in waves, and so that the most distinctive birds, their ancestors had got here first, and it was an ongoing thing that occasionally they were still coming in, which is true. Some songbirds have come into Australia, but, and this is a very big but, they have ancestors that had left Australia in the first instance.
I can't help but notice when you say something like this that it kind of mirrors the myth of terra nullius in Australia, that there was no one here, no one living here until the Europeans came, except the odd Aboriginal person here and there. Then they came in. Civilization reached Australia from the northern hemisphere. It came in, and that's where it all began. Now we know, of course, that wasn't true at all. Do you think there was an element of that kind of, I don't know, would you call it a prejudice, or would you call it a kind of way of thinking that seemed to fit neatly into that idea of the birds coming here from the northern hemisphere?
Look, there was definitely a northern hemisphere bias, and it's most clear not when you go back 100 years, but when you look at the first evidence that was produced to show this wasn't true. And so
what was that?
Well, it was comparing bird proteins, so highly technical sort of chemical studies. This was done in the 1980s by two Australians. They couldn't get their research published. It took them 4 years before an international journal would accept it. And this paper was suggesting that the songbirds had originated in Australia, and they just got rebuffed. And when the paper finally was published, they had this wording forced on them in the end, thus it is not beyond the grounds of possibility to suggest, well, it needs a lot more testing, but maybe just possibly it's a teeny-weeny little bit possible. This ridiculous wording. And when their paper came out, it was just totally ignored for years. I mean, they could have done better research, follow-up research, and it wasn't really until an American-led team published their own research quite a few years later that the world finally said, oh, we better take this seriously.
And what's the DNA evidence telling us now?
Oh, it's just overwhelming. It's consensus science now, so it's showing that there was a whole series of waves of birds flowing out of Australia. Some of them seem to have gone straight to Africa. Vireos got to North America without leaving any trace of themselves anywhere outside Australia. And it's been ongoing that orioles, and see, Ernst Mayr, when he's saying, look, the birds have to have flowed into Australia. You've got all these orioles in Asia, Africa, Europe, just a few species in Australia. But now we know that, sure, there's just a few in Australia, but when they got to the other continents, they evolved into a lot more. It doesn't tell you anything about the direction, the fact that there's more outside Australia.
There's the story in there of the white-winged chough, a reasonably commonplace bird in Australia. And you say that the white-winged chough is an Australian bird that enslaves other birds. Explain how.
Well, they're communal breeders, so two of them aren't enough. We've got a very infertile landscape, and so they need a lot of helpers to help the parents bring up the chicks. And so a small group of choughs, it can have greater success bringing up its young if it's got more helpers. And so they can con young birds from other chough groups by having these special wing displays and calls.
How do they con other birds? How do they do that?
Well, they have a special display like the parents of these choughs would use. And so you'll have a big squabble and a fight, and these special ritualised displays will lure these young birds into joining this new group.
How does that work? They expand their wings, these older ones, these parents,
flap
in
the
front of
tail.
these teenagers, essentially, and that somehow tells them, do as you're told and follow me.
Yeah, come with us. But the young choughs, they're not as stupid as it seems. It's been observed that when they are doing this helping, when they are providing the food to the chicks, they'll actually put a little grasshopper in the chick's mouth, but then eat it themselves. And so they'll just pretend they're helping. Now, part of what makes this really interesting is that we have all these extreme behaviours in birds. I mean, there's no birds outside the world that practice kidnapping. You think, why are they all here? And the magpie's extreme, the lyrebird's extreme. But this is what you get when the songbirds have been here for just so long that they've just been evolving into this and doing that. All the songbirds in the rest of the world are relatively young by comparison. And then when you get to the northern hemisphere, like Europe, North America, winters are so cold that they're all migrating, and that those harsh winters really limit all the social complexities they can get into. So the birds are so boring. And then the whole science of bird biology came out of Europe and North America. The textbooks are saying you get a pair of birds, the male calls in spring, they build a nest, have the young, fly south for the winter. And that was the way birds are meant to behave. You come to Australia, there's all these weird and wonderful things going on. And in the 19th century or the early 20th century, people said, well, this is just wacko. It's topsy-turvy land down under. You can't understand it. It's just weird stuff. Now we know, well, this is where the songbirds originated. It doesn't have harsh winters. The birds have just been at it and trying out all these different things that they can do. And so you've got this amazingly broad behavioural repertoire, calls that go from the lyrebird symphonies to the horrible, harsh, noisy miners. There's just everything and anything going on here, and it makes it the most wonderful place to try and understand birds.
The fact that they practice deception in the white-winged chough is just one example of that. It suggests that there is a degree of intelligence there too, doesn't it?
These are smart birds. Oh, choughs are smart. They're tool users.
They're tool users? What tools do they use?
They've been seen smashing open mussel shells with another mussel shell.
Wow. So there's lots of evidence to suggest that Australian birds many Australian birds do exhibit a high degree of intelligence. How about play? Play is often seen as a sign of intelligence.
That's right.
Birds play?
Yes, magpies play and parrots. I mean, the two groups of birds that have the highest intelligence are the songbirds and the parrots, and Australia was the source of both. So we are the land of intelligent birds. We gave the world its most intelligent birds, and we have so many large songbirds in Australia. The big ones tend to be smart, that we have amazingly intelligent birds.
Have you seen birds play?
I've certainly seen.
And what do they do when they play?
Oh, well, big cockatoos. You can see them playing on roofs, chewing nails and sliding down wires and under sprinklers running around, just like puppies to some extent.
The parrot you mentioned there, how different is the beak of a parrot to that of a pigeon, for example?
Oh, well, it's amazingly strong. And I think that one reason why birds have proliferated so well in Australia is that, I don't want to denigrate the marsupials, but you can see that marsupials haven't filled all the kind of ecological roles that you see in mammals overseas, so that instead of us having squirrels and monkeys chewing on fruits and cracking open seeds, we've got big parrots doing it. And so here are parrots doing what are otherwise done by birds. And we've got cockatoos that dig up the ground. They're digging tubers out of the ground. Well, birds don't normally dig holes in the ground to get tubers.
Parrots, as we know, are excellent mimics of human speech, but there are all sorts of stories about the intelligence of parrots. There is that story about that parrot Alex that was raised in the United States by a woman who seemed to be able to not only speak but also describe with speech.
Oh yeah, that Alex. The Professor Pepperberg's research. There was a grey parrot from Africa, unfortunately, so it didn't make too big a deal. But hey, parrots still came out of Australia. But that parrot, she could ask it questions and it could answer. So she would give it a whole a plate full of all sort of different objects, like keys and buttons and fruits and things, and just say, how many blue? And he could just, even though they were all different objects, he could say 4.
4. It would say 4
Yes,
like that.
yes.
Didn't it? I think it apologised once to it, didn't it? When she tried to get it to do something it didn't want to do.
There's a whole book.
Yeah.
There's a whole book about this parrot.
Yeah. Definitely worth checking out on Googling. That is Alex the Parrot and Professor Pepperberg, as you say. Parrots seems like they're very successful creatures, but are they too successful in a way? Are they becoming a pest in Australia?
Yeah, no, it is a very interesting issue that if you go right back to the early colonial times, as soon as crops were being grown in Australia, you had cockatoos attacking them. And so you would have men with guns, but cockatoos are smart. They know what a gun is, or they can very quickly learn what a gun is, and so they'd have a sentry. I mean, this doesn't sound very biological, talking about a sentry bird, but it does actually seem to be accurate. This is what's going on. And so you had the situation, which has lasted right through today, where very large numbers of cockatoos are killed in crop defence because they are just so smart. They are so good at circumventing any system to keep them away from food crops.
New Zealand has a big green parrot called a kea. Tell me about the kea and how much damage a kea can do.
Look, I've had my soap stolen by one when I was backpacking, but it's fairly trivial. Well, I mean, if you just Google, you can get kea stories. So this Scottish tourist who had his passport stolen. Another one had a kea go inside and steal his money. They vandalise things.
How about livestock? Can they hurt livestock?
Oh yeah, the livestock's through. So this is still going on to a small extent. So they attack sheep. So they'll terrify sheep, particularly shorn sheep. They'll land on the back of a sheep after it's been shorn and then stab this great mandible into its back. The sheep goes berserk, running around with this big parrot with its wings held out on its back. There used to be YouTube footage, but I haven't seen it lately. So parrots would leap over precipices, according to eyewitnesses, or a sheep that was injured, somehow disabled. The parrot, group of keas will sit on its back, just rip open its flesh, and particularly go after the kidneys or take all the meat off the legs. And there are any number of these eyewitness accounts. Now, people didn't believe it. So you had commissions of inquiry, naturalists interviewing high country shepherds, because this is going on up in the mountains, not around Auckland or Wellington. These are alpine birds. And there seems to be absolutely no doubt these stories are true. And then when I saw this YouTube footage, it's like, oh yeah, this is for real.
Cassowaries, those huge flightless birds that live in far north Queensland around Cairns, they're often said to be dangerous to humans who get too close. There are warning signs to warn tourists particularly to keep away from them. How do they typically attack a human who comes too close to them?
Often they approach people and it's quite intimidating. If it's a full-fronted attack, they tend to kick. So they tend to use a foot. And so people have, had ribs broken and being stabbed by the toe, so very, very long spine on the toe.
Well, like how long? How long was it? Like 10 centimetres or 12?
Something like that.
Wow. So that can actually make a puncture someone with
Well,
it.
there was a Barry Tweet. He was whacked by one in the chest. I think it was about 1990. It was reported that it very narrowly missed his heart. So we're talking about the toe of a bird only just missing someone's heart as it stabbed straight into his chest.
What role do they play in an ecosystem? How do they, what kind of, as they're wandering around a rainforest, what do they actually do to help other species?
Well, I mean, they're the classic, what you call a ecosystem engineer. So we have all these big fruits in North Queensland. There's nothing else that will swallow the fruit to get the flesh. And then they just excrete the seeds out, sometimes miles away. So they are the forest makers in North Queensland. A lot of these giant rainforest trees are being spread by cassowaries.
When times get a bit tough or there's a drought or something, do they come into the suburbs of Cairns looking for food? Are they getting a bit like bears in North America in that sense?
They're very much like bears in North America. I was really a little bit shocked. So it was an article I was commissioned to write by Australian Geographic, and I spent quite a few days around Mission Beach, and the extent to which I was... you'd see a little warning cassowary recent crossing sign in a little back street somewhere near Mission Beach. Go and knock on a door. You're chatting to someone in their backyard and then boom, 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 big bird walks past. And I've got people telling me that they don't build fences because they want the cassowaries to visit. They're illegally feeding them. The Birds are taking their dog food, they're falling into swimming pools, they're eating their cherry tomatoes, and they're not coming in. Like, you've got to be close to the forest, so there's sort of very large interface between little bits of scrappy rainforest and housing estates, but they are truly urban birds. And so it's something that Australians don't really acknowledge, that we have overwhelmingly the world's biggest urban birds. I mean, these are the second biggest bird in the world. They're heavier than emus. Only ostriches are larger. In New Guinea, they kill a lot of people. There's only one death we know of in Australia, but there will be more deaths. I mean, I had a National Parks ranger tell me how he saw a cassowary go up and stare in a pram where there was a baby, and he's saying, oh man, if you had an incident like that, would it change? Would it be like flying foxes, where these ridiculous hysteria about diseases result in all this hostility? And so it is actually a potentially delicate relationship where we have this quite safe if you observe the rules, probably, but there's always the possibility of something going wrong.
It seems like, and I think this is something you alluded to earlier, that the fact we don't have dangerous mammals in Australia, we don't have lions, tigers and bears in Australia, the birds seem to have largely taken that place in the food chain, or that place in the predator stakes.
Wow, we got snakes and crocodiles.
Yeah, we do. That's true, but we don't have the mammals, so do we? Like they do in the
No, that's right. That's right. So cassowary, our most dangerous birds, the cassowary and the magpie, are more dangerous than any mammals we've got.
As part of your research for the book, you went to Hawaii, which used to have the largest nectar birds in the world once. What happened to those nectar birds?
Actually, they weren't larger than ours, but they were the largest outside Australia. That was an amazing tragedy. It was a very personal experience for me. So at the time, these were thought to be honeyeaters. It was, I think, about 2004 I was there, and I got taken to the back room of the museum, and all these drawers are pulled out, all these beautiful birds. And there's a curator saying, oh, that one's extinct, endangered. Oh, they're still common, endangered, extinct. And you're just looking at all these birds. And the biggest of them all, the one that had the greatest interest to me because of its size, but it turns out, it feeds on trees related to eucalypts. And I'm looking at, there's only 4 specimens. They disappeared really early. It looks like it was diseases that came in. So there were no mosquitoes originally in Hawaii. Mosquitoes came in, the protozoan diseases came in, etc., etc. And I'm staring into these glass eyes of this bird thinking, you're gone. What went wrong for you? And so we haven't had mass extinctions in Australia. Our mammals have done really badly. Our birds have done fairly well so far, but you just don't know what's around the corner.
You went into a forest there, a highly protected forest. What did and didn't you see there as you were going up the mountain?
Yeah, Huckalau Forest, that's the best surviving forest. And so the birds that are left are quite small, but I had a biologist sort of break down and cry talking about the birds, because the malarial diseases that are wiping out these birds, they're moving up the mountains with climate change, and so there are buckets of water stationed in the forest to detect mosquitoes, and I was helping inspect the buckets, and the mosquitoes were being found at higher altitudes, so very, very, very uncertain the future for those birds. In fact, one bird has gone extinct since I was on that island, the Pu'uli, a whole genus of bird, bang, gone.
You said we haven't had mass extinctions of birds in Australia, but we are in one of those great periods worldwide of mass extinction at the moment. Is that on the cards for Australia, or how are Australian birds doing?
It's a trickle. The orange-bellied parrot in Tasmania, that's probably going to be the first to go. There's less than 100 of those left in the wild. Western ground parrot, that's not looking very good. I'm fairly sceptical about swift parrots surviving. Regent honeyeater is another one. So it's not like we're going to have an explosion, but there are the ones where you can look at them and really worry.
I'm going to look at the trees a lot differently now, Tim. It's been great speaking with you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.